Hello, it is with great pleasure that we present to you an interview between Maureen Duffy, Authors and Authors' Rights campaigner, and Francis Gurry, who will be moving on from 12 years as the Director General of the United Nations World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, where he has overseen a range of developments for the international IP community, of which we would particularly like to pay tribute to the adoption and growing widespread membership of the Marrakesh Treaty, which ensures access to specially adapted formats of books for many people with blindness or other visual impairments. This fantastic work has ensured that more people than ever can take part in culture. Francis and Maureen cover a lot of really interesting points throughout this discussion. This includes the need to value authors' works and what this may mean as the creative industries face digital transformation. He also discusses the balance of licensing, an issue that has long been debated at WIPO, and the way forward for fair rights to remuneration. On behalf of the International Authors Forum, I would like to thank Francis Gurry for taking the time to talk with Maureen Duffy and to give his insights on the challenges that authors face. Following on from this interview, I hope that viewers will take the time to read the IAF's new report, Creating a Living, which sets out the challenges for authors' incomes around the world and what can be done to ensure authors can continue to create and contribute to rich and diverse cultures. I hope you enjoy this discussion between Francis and Maureen. Thank you.
How do we now keep it going, support creators, and develop it, and make sure that the equivalent of climate change doesn't happen in the cultural world?
Yeah, so great question. I think that, you probably take issue with this first one, but let's say basically the legal framework is okay. Now we know there are some things to be tweaked in the legal framework, especially when you look at the impact of digital transformation.
Yeah.
So there are, adjustments that we do need to make. I don't wish to say there are not adjustments. But basically, the problem isn't the legal framework. The problem is, I think, first of all, a widespread awareness in the community that creators deserve a share of the value, the economic value that is created by their works. There are lots of other values, of course, created by their works, cultural values and social values, but there is an economic value, and creators must have a share of that. Now, people have to understand that, because you see that very often it was copying something or, basically intellectual theft was a victimless crime. It's not victimless. The victim is culture, and the sustainability of culture.
Yeah.
So I think we have to get out there with that message so that people understand. I think the second thing I would say is get people to consider that cultural support is an investment and not a cost.
Yes, and a human right.
Yeah. So what you are doing with the investment is giving rise to an enormous set of values, economic, social, cultural, which really enrich our lives in so many ways. So it shouldn't be regarded as a cost. It too often is when government budgets are considered, for example, of culture. It's a cost. It's not a cost. It's an investment for the society and also for the economy, for in terms of tourism and whatever else you might want when you ever have tourism. One of the things that, as you know, Maureen, that we have just started promoting is something called WIPO for Creators, which we're doing as a consortium with the Music Rights Awareness Foundation. And the idea here is that it's not confined to music, it's for all creators.
Yeah.
And for this to be a vehicle to do exactly what I mentioned, raise awareness of the importance of creators and we too often forget. There are other categories in society that we forget too, like teachers, but let's leave them for the moment and deal just with creators. The social function of creators is just so fundamental to our societies that we really need to get out and gather a widespread movement of support for creators. So that's what we want to do there. And I think this is what we have to do, and not be buried in, frankly, the confines of economic rationalism. You can't just take, now it's not a legal decision, it's not a case, it's a settlement, but you can't just take copyrighted works and feed them to an algorithm to create new works without it being an infringement of copyright. In other words, you need to make a payment to the authors if you are going to use their texts to feed to an algorithm to develop new texts.
Yeah, we had an old motto on the original Writers' Action Group that campaigned for public lending right in the UK, which was no use without payment.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And you see, it brings us back to an old dilemma, of course, in intellectual property, which is that you have a strong, well, to some extent scientific, but an economic pressure to say, no, free flow of data. You should have free flow of data. So it's important to be able to feed, algorithms with all sorts of data. And I think we come back to this old question of, yeah, look, we're all in favor of free flow of data and information, and we're all in favor of the widest possible access, but you won't have any data of a creative variety. You won't have any works to have access to unless you have authors. And you won't have any authors if there is not a possibility of a viable economic existence for the authors. So it's a balance question.
Yeah, yeah. You've probably come across the Internet Archive case.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a very personal interest in that they have 10 of my titles without permission and without payment.
That they've put up, and Brewster Kahle has put up. But this is
back to my very, very first novel.
Really?
Yes.
So, but this is now the subject of litigation, isn't it, in the US?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how far it's got, but I think it's the publishers who've taken that again.
Yeah. Look, I think it's a fundamental disrespect for cultural creativity to do this. It's a fundamental disrespect. It's a violation of rights too, but it's a fundamental disrespect for the value created by authors. And we have to, that's what we have to get out there with the message, is that it's not easy to be an author. It's not easy in so many ways, as you know better than anyone. There are so many challenges to sustain authorship over a long period of time, as you have done, Maureen. So many challenges. So, do we value this as a society? We have to find, appropriate means to give economic recognition to this as well. We need to focus a bit on infrastructure. And what's that mean? Well, I think it means they have to have a copyright system.
Yeah.
So they have to have a legal system, and you have to try to encourage the institutions that assist creators, whether it's collective management institutions or other institutions that are there to support creators in difficult existence of creation. And so that's where we can play a role at WIPO. We can, and we do, and we assist. And these days, that part of that infrastructure, I think, that is extremely important is connectivity and distribution channels.
What can WIPO do?
Yeah, well.
And how can we help? That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I go back to, you know, and I just then mention it and put it aside. The need for us to be more efficient in communication of the value of supporting creators. So WIPO for Creators, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for people to come together and express themselves as being friends of creators.
Expand that into visual arts and literature.
Absolutely. So it's going to be, you know, a good start with music, but absolutely indispensable that we get authors and all other visual artists, all other creators involved, because that's what we're talking about. And of course, the creative landscape and actors are in transition and changing and you know, using different media. So we need all creators. So that's on that level. Look, I think that one of the big issues out there, and it links up with of course, what you've just been saying about platforms and concentration of power. One of the big issues out there is the value chain.
Yeah.
Now, we've been through that a bit here in terms of the agenda for exceptions and limitations. Now, as you know, Maureen, because you've sat through, you know, many meetings on this, it's a bit all over the place. You know, people will criticize me for saying this. I'm not against exceptions and limitations, you know, at all. Legitimate exceptions and limitations are necessary for having a balanced copyright system. That's not the problem. The problem is that in this digital transformation, new actors are appearing in the value chain. You know, we didn't have these big, enormously powerful distribution platforms 20 years ago, 25 years ago, let's say. And a company like Amazon is, I don't know what its latest market capitalization is, but it's over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
You know, that's more than the economy of the size of the economy in the vast majority of countries, apart from 20.
Yes.
20 countries. So,
and of course, it's not paying adequate taxes in the countries where it is.
So that's another issue. Is where how you locate the place of value creation for all these data flowing around the world. Big issue, which is playing out, you know, and playing out mainly in the OECD, where they are trying to come to some form of digital tax, and of course it's a big power struggle. But going back to the value chain, I think one of the difficulties that we've had in the exceptions and limitations agenda is that it has been tended to be for each exception a single focus. And now I think for each exception we can agree that there are very legitimate reasons for the exceptions that have been enumerated for discussion. But people are afraid of touching this value chain where, for example, everyone is in transition and where we're going from we're still going from a physical world to this digital world. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that in anything we do, we consider all the actors in the value chain. So you can't consider distribution, you know, and the librarians will be upset with me for saying this. You can't consider just distribution without considering authors. and publishers, because you've got nothing to distribute if you don't have authors, and if you don't have a publisher for their works.
Yeah.
So my personal preference is for any action to take into account the valued and important actors in the value chain as a whole, and not just one. We need to know where our values lie, and one of them is that at the beginning of the value chain, and you have no value chain without it, are creators. In this case, authors.
Well, obviously, I would agree with that, Francis. But this is why I'm partly, interested in the making available right, and how that might come up with some.
Well, I think it's irrelevant. I think it's very relevant, and as you know, it's playing out a bit at the moment. In some countries, in Australia, it's playing out at the moment.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, because they're.
I haven't picked that up.
Yeah, they're proposing to require platforms to pay for content that they use in various ways. Yeah, well, it's a big, quite controversial, quite, a thing. Yeah, look, making available. I think this is a very, of course, as you know, it was really brought into being by the 1996 WIPO copyright treaties, which were designed to adapt the system to the reality of digital distribution and the internet. I think it's very important because it's very important first for the aggregators, not for them, but because of them, it's very important. So the aggregators who are, just linking to other sites and concentrating the value of all of those sites for themselves, without necessarily paying for it, anything. It's very important also for the reasons that we discussed earlier about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Can you just take things, data, and you treat creations as data that can be freely fed to algorithms? Can you just do that? So I think you're right, Maureen. There's the right to make available is a very relevant one in the digital age when everything's available.
Yeah. So could we have a making available right treaty?
Well, look, I think we seriously have to think about this. We really seriously have to think about it because you can. Well, it depends a bit on your, of course, philosophy of quote regulation unquote, your philosophy of intervention or not. And of course, we all know there are some people who feel that there is that the market is the great regulator of everything, and there are others who believe that you need state intervention and regulation.
Yeah,
so
interesting because at a meeting I was at on this Internet Archive business, some person from the other side said that licensing was just market failure. And that really does seem the extreme of capitalism.
Yeah. Well, you see, I think you have to think also, I mean, we often think in terms of intellectual property, copyright in particular, being incentive, creators of incentive for creation, but you have to have a means of trading intellectual assets.
Yeah.
And licensing is the best way to have voluntary transactions between people in relation to intellectual assets.
Yeah.
And as those intellectual assets become more and more important, either for scientific or for cultural reasons, so I would regard licensing as an absolutely indispensable mechanism for ensuring the distribution of intellectual assets across society.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a direction, coupled with the right of making available, maybe that's a direction of evolution of the copyright system that...
Collective management.
Sorry?
Collective management?
Yeah, but
individual authors can't really
or licensing, as opposed, you see, we had, if you take the rough analogy with music, the first models, digital models for music, were models which recreated the physical world, as it were. So Apple, iTunes, you bought a song, as it were. You didn't really buy it, but you bought a song, but it was just digitizing the model of the physical world, which was that you sold songs and you sold them in CDs and others.
Yeah.
Now, when you consider where we are now, 20 years later, where we're streaming models for distribution and consumption of music, which is a very different model. In other words, a model for the digital world, which is not a recreation of the physical world model, has been created, namely streaming or subscription. It's another one, another model. So for books, when you consider how creators use different multimedia, as they say, use different forms of expressions to develop creations, and then maybe authors should think a little bit about licensing parts of work, or licensing for shorter periods of time, and so on. So in other words, maybe there is an evolution of licensing models to adapt to styles of use, consumption, and also creation in the digital framework. So look, on the resale right, I'm a great advocate and favour of transforming the facility that exists in the international treaties now, saying you can have a resale right, to requiring it. You must have a resale right. And I think, excuse me, you're absolutely right. It is like the public lending right. It's a similar philosophy, let's say, philosophical basis. And I think it's entirely appropriate, and we have workable schemes. They work on small percentages, very small percentages. So why can't we do it? Well, I think that's a very difficult question, because what we work on in the international system, as you know, is consensus. And consensus you can look at in two ways. You can be looked at as a beautiful thing, that you get everyone agreeing that they're not going to object to progress, at least. But you can look at it another way, which is that it's a right of veto. And so you only need one person, one country, to say, we'll hold out there, and you can't get consensus and you can't go forward. So what can we do about that? And I think this is an evolution that has to happen in the international system, frankly, because you can't have, things being vetoed all the time. So I think we have to refine our notion of what consensus means, and when it is appropriate or legitimate to object to something going forward. Now, I think you could say, well, it's legitimate if the thing that is proposed is going to affect your interests directly. Now let's take a country that does not have the resale right, and everyone else wants to do the resale right, and we know such countries.
Yeah.
So it says, no, we don't have it, so we don't want everyone else to have it. But I don't think that's legitimate.
No,
unless it
surely
affects
it must. Can it be a majority?
well, no, I would say you can only exercise that right of objecting to consensus when it affects your interests. Now, if you take the resale right, let's take country X that does not have the resale right, it doesn't have to join the treaty. It just has to not object to the treaty being concluded. And then they can say, well, you go off, you do your treaty, you conclude it. It's not going to affect us because we're not going to join the treaty. In fact, it will have a positive effect on them because their country's nationals who are creators will enjoy the benefits of the resale right when their works are sold in third-party markets. I don't think it's legitimate to object to the resale right. I think it should be going forward. And we have to refine in the international system our understanding of when it is legitimate to object to consensus. And you shouldn't be able to object to consensus when it does not affect your interests.
You can object, but that doesn't mean that your objection will stifle it. You then have the possibility not to sign.
That's right. You don't. That's the normal international rule, is you don't have to sign on to a treaty. Now, I can understand that even though you have that right not to sign on, you should have the right to object to a treaty if people are going to do a treaty which is going to have a directly negative, in your perception, impact on your country. But it's not a directly negative impact, the resale right. In fact, it has no impact but positive. So, yeah, like I'm a big proponent of the resale right. I think it should be done. Those that are not ready to adopt it, just stay out. But that's what happens internationally. And then after 10 years, they come in and we gradually get universal coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now the public lending right's a bit more difficult because, of course, you're asking governments to put aside some portion of their budget.
Yeah.
And for all the reasons that we discussed earlier, that it's very difficult for some countries to do that because of the shortage of resources.
But then, if you think of a little country like Malawi that is prepared to do it,
yeah,
and is doing it.
Fantastic success.
Yeah, yeah. And I reckon if Malawi can do it, all sorts of other countries who think they can't will find they can, because it supports their own authors and their own creative industries, apart from, maintaining their cultural, their contribution to cultural diversity and so on. But it is a legitimate expense for a government, as other things like education and research and so on are.
Look, I'm in favour, absolutely in favour, a big proponent of public lending right. I think it's a great thing. And particularly when you consider the possibility of the transformation of the lending, ordinary lending, done by libraries and other institutions to a broader audience, indeed internationally. So then it becomes important, all the more important. I think that what we have to, but I can't see that we would get there with the treaty, requiring it. I think what we have to do is to work on practical schemes, explaining the benefits, such as, as you did in relation to Malawi, but not only explaining the benefits, but also supporting them to introduce such a right.
Yeah.
And of course, the Public Lending Right International, if I've got the name correctly, Public International.
Yeah, International Public Lending Right. Yeah.
International Public. Has done a fantastic job.
We support.
That's right.
And very much so through the work of Jim Parker, who sadly has had to retire. And he's done great work going from country to country, explaining the ways of practically setting it all up and so on.
It's a fantastic job they've done. And I think the sort of strategy should be to expand the circle. You know, you're not going to be able to impose the solution, as it were, but expand the circle as the International Public Lending Right Consortium is doing. Just exactly that, getting more countries to sign on.
Yeah,